The white cake box was already sitting on the bakery counter. "Happy 63rd birthday, Dad," written across it in frosting, when the young woman in a worn waitress uniform quietly pushed it back toward the cashier. She'd counted the money in her wallet twice. It wasn't enough. So she apologized, forced a smile, and turned toward the door, while somewhere across Chicago, her aging father was still waiting for a birthday that wasn't coming. She didn't know that 3 steps behind her stood a man in a black suit, a man the whole city spoke of in whispers, a man the police kept files on 3 drawers deep, Nicholas Falcone, a single father, a man they said had never forgiven anyone, never bowed to anyone, never once cared about a stranger's tears. He was the last person on earth anyone would expect to notice a poor waitress giving up her father's birthday cake. But he did, and what this man did next was something no one saw coming, not his men, not the woman, not even him. If you believe kindness can still find its way into the darkest of hearts, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who still believes people can change, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's go back to that bakery on a cold Chicago morning, where everything began. A few hours before that moment in the bakery, while Chicago still lay buried beneath the bitter chill of the early morning fog, the lights in the study of the Falcone mansion had been burning since before dawn. Nicholas Falcone sat behind the oak desk with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and measured, like the sound of a blade being sharpened against stone. He spoke only a few brief sentences, saying that the southern docks would remain closed until he changed his mind, that not a single shipment was to leave before sunrise, and then he ended the call without waiting for an answer. On the other end of the line, men who had weathered danger and hardship all their lives immediately obeyed without question, because they understood that in this city, the word of Nicholas Falcone carried more weight than any contract, bearing a signature and a seal. Beyond the gates, 3 black SUVs were already idling, their darkened windows reflecting the towering iron fence still wet with the night's dew. Yet the man whose very name made the entire city lower its voice was being held back by something that had nothing to do with power. It was the soft shuffle of tiny slippers hurrying along the marble hallway. Lucy, his 6-year-old daughter, came carrying a leather-bound photo album, with worn corners pressed against her chest, her brown hair tangled from sleep, her wide eyes shining with a light that belonged only to children. She climbed into her father's lap and placed the album on the desk beside the files she was never allowed to open and had never once been curious enough to touch. Her tiny fingers turned the glossy pages one by one, passing photographs that had begun to fade beneath the slow hand of time. Then she stopped. The open page revealed a row of pictures taken over many years, and in every one of them sat the same woman with a gentle smile in front of a birthday cake, sometimes with candles flickering brightly, sometimes with white frosting smeared across the tip of her nose because someone had playfully dabbed it there. Lucy had never heard that woman's voice. She knew her mother only through these photographs and through the stories told by Mrs. Costa, the elderly housekeeper who often whispered that her mother had once been the person who laughed more than anyone else in that house. Her mother had died when Lucy was only 2, far too young to preserve even the smallest fragment of a memory for herself. The little girl pointed at the photograph, looked up at her father, and asked whether Mommy had a birthday cake every year. Nicholas lowered his eyes to the album page, and for one brief second, the man who had just shut down an entire harbor with a single phone call couldn't find a single word to say. He nodded. Lucy looked at the photograph for a long while, her small finger gently tracing the face of the mother she had never been able to hold. And then, in a clear, innocent voice that had no idea it was touching the deepest wound in her father's heart, she said that yesterday her teacher had talked about families, and all her classmates had said their homes had cakes on happy days. She said she wanted their home to have a real cake too, one bought from an actual bakery, so that she and her father could eat it together that evening, just like her mother in the photograph. A real cake. Those 3 simple words from the mouth of a 6-year-old child tightened around Nicholas's chest, as though an unseen hand had seized it. For 4 years, he hadn't stepped inside a single bakery. It wasn't because he was too busy, nor was it because he was arrogant. It was because a bakery had been the last place Teresa visited on that fateful morning. The morning she carried a box of the waffle cookies their daughter loved, walked toward the car parked along the curb, and never came home again. The explosion had been meant for him. She was the one who died. From that day forward, the scent of baked butter and vanilla became something he avoided even more instinctively than the barrel of a gun. Lucy continued gazing up at him. waiting, both arms wrapped around the album as though she were holding a priceless treasure. Nicholas studied his daughter for a long moment. He could refuse an entire council of dangerous men without blinking. But he had never learned how to refuse those eyes. He reached out, smoothed her tangled hair, and quietly told her that yes, their home would have a real cake that evening. Lucy cried out with delight and threw her arms tightly around her father's neck, and her bright laughter rang through a room that, for years, had known nothing but the rustle of documents and the cold voices of business calls. That morning, instead of allowing the motorcade to take him straight to the office as it did every day, Nicholas told the driver to stop in the old neighborhood north of the river, in front of a small bakery, with a wooden sign painted with the words, Marlowe's Bakery. Tommy Greco sat in the front seat and glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but he didn't ask a question. Nicholas remained motionless inside the vehicle for nearly a minute, staring at the glowing window where the warmth from the ovens breathed softly into the freezing morning air. Then he opened the door, crossed the sidewalk, and pushed open the bakery's wooden entrance. The small brass bell hanging above the frame gave a clear, delicate chime, and Nicholas Falcone's 4 years of running away ended there, though he didn't yet know that inside, fate was already waiting for him in the form of a white cake box and a woman counting the last coins in her purse. Inside the bakery, the air seemed to sag beneath the weight of the young woman's apology. The girl behind the counter held the white box against her chest with the helpless confusion of someone who didn't know where to put her guilt, while the woman in the faded, worn waitress uniform had already turned away and was walking slowly toward the door. A small name tag pinned crookedly above her breast read Beatrice, and beneath it was the nearly colorless logo of some restaurant. Nicholas stood beside the window, the hot cup of coffee he had ordered while waiting his turn still untouched in his hand. He hadn't intended to watch her leave, but just as Beatrice reached out to push open the wooden door, the old leather wallet in her hand caught on the strap of her purse, and a small photograph slipped free, tilted through the air, then fell onto the tiled floor, landing face up in the middle of the aisle. Beatrice didn't notice. The door closed behind her as the brass bell chimed once more, this time sounding almost like a sigh. Nicholas set down his coffee, stepped forward, bent, and picked up the photograph. Then he went still. It was an old picture faded to the warm yellow of honey, its corners worn white from being handled too many times, the kind of mark found only on photographs someone had carried close for years. In it stood a young firefighter, tall and broad, his face darkened by the sun, and his smile stretching all the way to the corners of his eyes, holding a little girl of perhaps 5 or 6 high on his shoulders. The child had both hands raised, her head thrown back as she laughed, her 2 small braids flying loose. The man wore the dark blue dress uniform of the Chicago Fire Department, its brass buttons gleaming, the insignia on his chest blurred by the age of the print, but still recognizable as the familiar shape of a firefighter's helmet set within a wreath. Behind the father and daughter, on a plain wooden table in a small kitchen, sat a homemade cake, leaning badly to one side, its white frosting spread with clumsy hands and several candles planted at crooked angles, the kind of cake made by an awkward father learning to bake for his daughter for the first time. It hadn't come from a bakery. It wasn't beautiful, yet the entire photograph held a kind of happiness no expensive cake could ever buy. Nicholas turned it over. On the back, in faded ballpoint ink and the firm, slightly slanted handwriting of a man, someone had written, "Every year on my birthday, all I need is to see my little girl smile." Nicholas's finger remained over those words longer than it needed to. Then his gaze returned to the front of the photograph and settled on the firefighter's uniform. 1 second. 2 seconds. For a man like Nicholas Falcone, who had never allowed anything in his life to hold his attention for more than a moment, that was already far too long, something passed through his gray eyes so quickly that even Tommy Greco, had he been standing there, wouldn't have known what to call it. It wasn't curiosity, and it wasn't quite emotion. It was more like the faint echo of a door he had believed locked shut long ago. Then it vanished. His face became still again, smooth and unreadable as a winter lake. He closed his hand around the photograph and pushed open the door. Beatrice hadn't gone more than 20 steps down the sidewalk. Her back was straight, but her shoulders weren't, the posture of someone accustomed to reminding herself that she wasn't allowed to collapse. Nicholas called after her in a deep voice that didn't need to rise in order to make people stop. She turned, slightly startled to see the man in the black suit standing there with the photograph extended in his hand. For an instant, Beatrice froze, then quickly touched her wallet as though confirming what had happened, and color rose into her cheeks with embarrassment. She came back and accepted the photograph with both hands, holding it as carefully as though someone had returned a part of her body she had accidentally dropped, then thanked him in a voice so soft it nearly disappeared into the cold wind. Her eyes were still red from inside the bakery, and she tried to offer him a polite smile, the strained smile of someone using every ounce of strength simply to remain standing. Nicholas looked at her and said only one thing: "Happy birthday to your father." He didn't ask questions. He didn't pry. It was only a simple wish. Yet it made Beatrice blink several times because she hadn't expected this stranger to have noticed the words written on the cake box she had just left behind. She lowered her head and thanked him again, tucked the photograph into the deepest compartment of her wallet, the safest place, then turned and continued on her way. Nicholas remained on the sidewalk with both hands in his trouser pockets, watching her go. She didn't walk toward a parking lot. She continued down the street, past 3 blocks, all the way to the bus stop at the corner, where she stood beneath the shelter with both arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She had sold her car the year before, something Nicholas couldn't have known that morning. All he saw was a woman who had just left behind her father's birthday cake, standing in the freezing wind to wait for a bus, while inside her wallet rested a photograph of a firefighter beside a cake leaning to one side. Nicholas turned, pushed open the door, and went back into the bakery. The white box was still sitting on the counter. The young woman behind the counter still didn't know what to do with the white box. When Nicholas approached, she began explaining awkwardly, as though trying to defend herself, saying that the bakery couldn't refund the deposit because the cake had already been decorated with a personal name, that she truly wished she could help. But rules were rules. Then her voice grew softer. "Poor woman," she said. She had been a regular customer there for as long as anyone could remember. Nicholas said nothing. He only looked at the box, and his silence made the young woman continue, as though she needed to release something that had been weighing heavily on her heart. Beatrice's father had once been a firefighter. He had served at a nearby station for several decades, and in the old days, he used to come in every month to buy waffle cookies for his daughter. Everyone at the bakery had loved him. Then he became ill, struck by the kind of disease that slowly stole a person's memories, and both of his lungs had been damaged after a lifetime of breathing smoke. Now he could no longer go anywhere on his own. Beatrice worked 2 shifts at Doyle's Chop House, one in the morning and another at night. People said she hadn't taken a single day off in years. She had ordered this cake 3 weeks earlier, and had come by every week to pay a little at a time, always counting every small bill one by one. The young woman paused, her eyes beginning to glisten. Yet when the day finally came for her to collect the cake, she still didn't have enough to pay the remaining balance. The girl didn't know what had happened to the money Beatrice had saved. She only knew that earlier that morning, the woman had counted her money twice, then asked to cancel her father's birthday cake in a calm voice, as though she had grown far too accustomed to letting go of the things she wanted. Nicholas listened to everything without interrupting her once. Then he took out his wallet, placed the remaining amount on the counter along with additional money, and spoke with the quiet composure of a man discussing something perfectly ordinary. He said he would pay what was still owed on the cake, but he needed the bakery to do something for him. The young woman looked up and waited. He told her to call Beatrice using the telephone number written on the order form and explain that there had been an error in the bakery's records. She was to say that an anonymous community support fund for longtime local families had covered the remaining balance in full. The cake was waiting for her to collect it. She wasn't to mention any customer who had been inside the bakery that morning. No name, no trace. The young woman blinked several times and opened her mouth, as though she meant to ask a question, but then thought better of it. There was something in this man's eyes that told her he wasn't accustomed to being questioned. She simply nodded, picked up the order form with the telephone number written on it, and began dialing. Nicholas didn't remain to hear the call. He picked up the coffee that had already gone cold, left several more bills to pay for it even though it had never touched his lips, then pushed open the door and stepped outside. The black SUV was still parked across the street, and when he settled into the rear seat, Tommy Greco looked at his employer through the rearview mirror. Tommy had been at Nicholas's side for 15 years, long enough to read every centimeter of that face, long enough to know that for the past 4 years it had displayed only 2 expressions: cold and colder. Yet now, at the corner of the mouth of the most powerful man on the South Side, there was a smile. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was real. Tommy didn't ask. He merely started the engine in silence and told himself that he had just witnessed something he had never seen in all those 15 years. 3 blocks away, at the corner intersection, Beatrice was still sheltering beneath the roof of the bus stop when the telephone in her coat pocket began to vibrate. She saw the bakery's number glowing on the screen, and her heart tightened because she couldn't understand what else could have happened. Then she answered. The voice of the young woman from the bakery came through, slightly trembling but careful and clear with every word. "Ma'am, we're sorry, but there was an error in our records. Your cake order has actually been paid for by the city's Retired Firefighter Appreciation Fund through its Family Support Program for former firefighters. Your cake is still here, and you may come back to collect it whenever you're ready." Beatrice stood motionless. She asked again, her voice suddenly unsteady, whether there had to be some mistake, because her father had never applied for any such program. The voice on the other end simply repeated with gentle assurance that everything had been paid in full and that she only needed to come and collect the cake. The call ended, but Beatrice kept the telephone pressed to her ear for several more seconds, even though the other line had already gone silent. Then she turned around and retraced the path she had just taken, every step becoming quicker than the last, until near the end she was almost running. When she pushed open the bakery door, the brass bell chimed, and the white box was still there on the counter, the frosted words wishing her father a happy 63rd birthday still perfectly intact, as though nothing had ever happened. The young woman behind the counter slid the box toward her and smiled. Beatrice reached out with both hands and accepted it slowly, carefully, as though she feared it was only a dream that would shatter if she touched it too firmly. She thanked the girl, but her voice caught halfway through the words. Then she held the box close and stepped outside. On the way back to the bus stop, she walked much more slowly than before. Once she stood beneath the shelter again, surrounded by strangers with their heads lowered over their telephones. Beatrice looked down at the white box in her arms, and her shoulders began to tremble. She cried without making a sound, her tears falling onto the lid, and she hurriedly wiped them away with her sleeve, as though afraid they might soak through and ruin her father's cake. The bus pulled up to the curb. She climbed aboard, holding the box against her chest as though she were embracing something more precious than anything she had possessed in many years. By the time darkness fell, Beatrice had returned to the small apartment on the 3rd floor of an aging building on the south side. She stood outside the door for a moment, drew a deep breath, carefully rearranged the smile on her face, and only then slipped the key into the lock. Inside, Walter Monroe sat in the armchair beside the window, a thin blanket spread across his knees, his silver-white hair neatly combed, because that morning he had reminded himself again and again that today was an important day, though by afternoon he could no longer remember exactly why it mattered. At the sound of the door opening, he turned, and when he saw his daughter standing there with the white box in her hands, his deeply lined face brightened as though someone had lit a lamp from within. Beatrice placed the cake box on the small wooden table in the middle of the room, where she had already spread the finest tablecloth they owned the night before. She lifted the lid, revealing the cake beneath, its frosting smooth and white, the words "Happy 63rd Birthday" written carefully across the top, with small flowers of icing decorating the edges. Walter stared at it for a long time, his lips moving silently as he read the words in the frosting. Then he looked up at his daughter and asked softly, "Is today really my birthday?" Beatrice nodded and placed the candles into the cake one by one, her voice light and gentle, as though nothing had happened that morning. "Yes, Dad, it's your birthday. Our whole family is celebrating." She struck the lighter, and the small flames came to life. In their warm golden glow, she sang the birthday song in a quiet voice, meant only for the two of them. Walter straightened as much as his aging back allowed, his thin hands resting along the edge of the table, his eyes glistening as he watched the tiny flames tremble. When the song ended, Beatrice told him to blow out the candles and remember to make a wish. The old man closed his eyes for several seconds, solemn as a child, then pursed his lips and blew. It took him 2 breaths to extinguish them all, because his lungs weren't what they once had been. But when the thin trails of smoke began to rise, he smiled, and that smile made Beatrice turn away and pretend to search for the cake knife, so he wouldn't see how suddenly her eyes had begun to burn. She cut a slice, placed it on a porcelain plate, and handed it to him with a small fork. Walter lifted the first bite to his mouth and chewed slowly. Then he stopped and looked up at his daughter with a strange, distant expression. "It tastes exactly like the cakes your mother used to make." Beatrice went still for a moment. Her mother had been gone for nearly 20 years. She smiled and said, "Yes, Dad, it really does." The old man nodded and continued eating, contentment spreading across his face. After a while, he suddenly reached across the table, took his daughter's hand, patted it gently, and said, "Ruth, our little girl has gotten too thin lately. We need to cook more good food for her." Ruth was her mother's name. Beatrice sat without moving. She didn't correct him. She simply turned her hand over, closed her fingers around her father's frail ones, and answered softly, "Yes, we'll cook more good food for her." Walter smiled kindly and returned to his cake, eating as he told a rambling story with no clear beginning or end about the old fire station and the men he had served beside, men whose names he could still remember, even though he had forgotten what day of the week it was. Beatrice sat listening, her hand still wrapped around his, nodding at the right moments, and in that small room beneath the warm yellow light, the white cake slowly disappeared one slice at a time. At that same moment, on the other side of the city, another cake was being cut in the vast dining room of the Falcone mansion. Lucy was kneeling on her chair, her eyes fixed on her father's hands as he placed a slice onto her plate, while she chattered without pause that it was the most beautiful cake she had ever seen, and that tomorrow she was going to tell everyone in her class about it. Nicholas sat beside her and watched her devour the cake until frosting covered the tip of her nose. He reached out and gently wiped it away with one finger, exactly like a gesture from an old photograph he never mentioned. Lucy looked up at him while she chewed, then suddenly tilted her head and asked in her clear, innocent voice, "Why are you so happy today, Dad?" Nicholas paused. He hadn't realized he was happy. He only knew that tonight, for the first time in 4 years, the scent of vanilla and baked butter inside the house didn't make his chest ache. He stroked his daughter's hair and told her to keep eating before the frosting melted, and Lucy giggled without asking anything more. That night, the lights in both homes at opposite ends of the city stayed on later than usual, and everyone inside slept peacefully. The next morning, Nicholas was seated behind his desk in the study when Tommy Greco knocked and entered, placing the usual monthly files in front of him, financial reports, and a list of the businesses in the area paying protection fees to his organization. Nicholas turned each page with the familiar concentration of a man who had been reading lists like these for more than a decade. Then his eyes stopped. The 11th line, Doyle's Chop House. He read it again. It was the name of the restaurant printed on the faded logo of the crooked name tag pinned to the woman's uniform at the bakery the previous morning. The restaurant where she worked 2 shifts every day and hadn't taken a day off in years. That restaurant, it turned out, had been sending money into the coffers of his organization every month in exchange for the privilege of operating in peace. Nicholas lowered the file onto the desk, his finger tapping slowly against the 11th line. He had believed his story with that woman had ended yesterday, neat and clean like everything else he did. He had been wrong. Nicholas said nothing more about the 11th line throughout that morning, but before Tommy left the room, he merely tapped a finger against the name Doyle's Chop House and said exactly 4 words, "Investigate this place thoroughly." Tommy looked at the line, then at his employer, nodded, and left. To those who worked for the Falcone family, the shorter an order was, the heavier it carried, and Tommy understood that the word thoroughly from Nicholas meant turning over every invoice, questioning every person, and tracing every dollar that had entered or left that restaurant over the course of many years. 3 days later, Tommy returned to the study carrying a thick file and wearing the expression of a man forced to deliver bad news to someone who never welcomed bad news. He placed the file on the desk, and instead of offering his usual summary, he began with a single sentence. "You should read it yourself." Nicholas opened the file. The first page held a photograph of Gordon Doyle, the restaurant owner, a man in his 50s with the smile of someone accustomed to getting his way. The pages that followed contained recorded statements from former employees who had already left, photocopies of payroll sheets, and columns of numbers arranged with a neatness so cold it made the blood run thin. For years, Doyle had routinely taken 30% of every server's tips, calling it a management fee, even though not a single document proved that such a fee legally existed. He forced employees to remain after their shifts to clean, take inventory, and prepare for the following day, adding 1 or 2 hours each night without paying a single cent of overtime. Anyone who questioned him lost the desirable shifts and was pushed into slow hours when there were no tips, until they understood the message and kept quiet or resigned. Near the bottom of the current employee list, Tommy had marked one name in pencil, Beatrice Monroe, employed there for more than 4 years, never once taking an annual vacation, and among those whose tips had been reduced the most because she worked both shifts. Nicholas reached that line and remained there for a long time, Then he turned to the final page, and it was the final page that seemed to lower the temperature of the room by several degrees. It was a transcript of Gordon Doyle's own words during a drinking session with his trusted managers, repeated exactly by one of the men who had been present. Doyle had laughed and said that his employees could complain to heaven itself and it still wouldn't matter, that no one in this neighborhood dared touch him because every month he paid the Falcone family in full. That money bought peace, and the Falconets had never allowed their clients to be troubled. Nicholas closed the file. He didn't strike the desk. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat there with his hands folded together on the wood. And Tommy, who had watched his employer make decisions that ruined men and families without the slightest change in expression, saw for the first time Nicholas's jaw tighten so slowly. Both men in that room understood what had just been laid out in black and white. Gordon Doyle didn't fear the law, the unions, or the press, because he believed he had purchased the finest insurance in the city, the name Falcone. The machine Nicholas had built so that no one would dare touch anything that belonged to him had, over the years, become a shield protecting a man who stole every small coin from those who poured drinks and carried plates, including the woman who had counted her money twice at the bakery counter, before quietly asking to cancel her father's birthday cake. The amount she had saved for 3 weeks and still couldn't cover, when measured honestly, might not even equal the tips taken from her in a single month. Nicholas rose and walked to the window, standing there as he looked down into the courtyard where Lucy was playing with Mrs. Costa, the child's laughter reaching him faintly through the thick glass. Tommy waited behind him, then finally asked how he wanted the matter handled. Nicholas didn't turn around. He remained silent a while longer, then said, "Not yet. Let me think. But starting this month, Doyle's is no longer on the list." Tommy nodded and withdrew, closing the door behind him. That night, after the mansion had gone dark and Lucy was sleeping soundly in her room with the photo album resting beside her pillow, Nicholas entered alone into the small room at the end of the second-floor hallway, the room he had preserved untouched for 4 years and forbidden anyone to enter. On the wooden cabinet against the wall stood a silver frame, and inside it Teresa was smiling, her eyes curved like slender moons. The smile he had once jokingly said was worth more than the entire Falcone fortune. Nicholas stood before that photograph for a very long time. He said nothing, lit no candle, and poured no drink. He simply stood with his hands at his sides, staring at the wife who had died because of a bomb meant for him, the woman who had once told him that the Falcone money meant nothing if all it could produce was fear. He hadn't answered her then. Tonight, standing in a room silent as a grave and looking at her motionless smile behind the glass, he still couldn't answer. But before he turned off the light and walked away, he had already made one decision, and Gordon Doyle, who was surely sleeping peacefully in the belief that the Falcone name protected him, would be the first man to learn what that decision meant. Gordon Doyle realized something was wrong on the first day of the following month, when the protection payment he transferred as usual was sent back to his account without a word of explanation. He called the intermediary who had collected the money for years, and for the first time in all that time, no one answered. He called a second time, then a third, then sent a message, and by the end of the day he received only one brief reply. "From now on, you're on your own." Doyle read those words again, and a chill traveled down his spine, the feeling of a man walking through winter when someone suddenly strips the only coat from his shoulders without telling him why. But before he could understand what he had lost, the truly frightening thing came knocking 2 weeks later, and it didn't come from the underworld. It arrived in an envelope bearing the seal of the Illinois Department of Labor. At an elegant law office in the heart of downtown, where the legal representatives of the Falcone companies had long conducted their business, a thick file had been carefully copied and submitted anonymously through the proper whistleblower channels: payroll records, statements from former employees, figures showing that 30% of workers' tips had been taken for years, and thousands of overtime hours had gone unpaid. The sender left no name, but the file had been organized so meticulously that the investigators had almost nothing left to do except verify it, and everything they verified matched. The investigation opened swiftly and cleanly. Labor inspectors arrived at Doyle's chop house on a Tuesday morning, seized the records, and interviewed the employees one by one in the back room. Doyle hired an attorney, and after reviewing the mountain of evidence, even his own lawyer advised him in the tone of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis: "Don't go to court. If you go to court, you'll lose everything. Settle." At the same time, word spread among former and current restaurant employees and a law firm specializing in workers' rights. for reasons no one could explain, became unusually eager to help and required no advance payment, gathering signatures for a class action lawsuit. Trapped between two crushing forces, the state investigation on one side and the class action suit on the other, Gordon Doyle, the man who had once laughed and said his employees could sue all the way to heaven and it still wouldn't matter, signed a settlement agreement after only a few months, agreeing to repay every dollar of stolen tips and unpaid overtime to all employees covered by the records, along with a penalty owed to the state. The amount was so large that he had to sell the restaurant to pay it, and the Doyle's Chop House sign was taken down on a quiet weekend afternoon, without ceremony or spectacle. Throughout the entire process, no one struck Doyle across the face. No one shattered a single pane of his glass, and not one threat was recorded or remembered. There were only documents, signatures, and absolute silence from the people he had once believed were his shield. Once, while waiting for his attorney in the hallway of an office building, Doyle grabbed the former intermediary who happened to pass by and asked almost pleadingly what he had done wrong to the Falcone family. The man removed Doyle's hand, straightened his sleeve, and answered in a voice as flat as still water. "You didn't do anything wrong to the Falcone family. You did wrong by your employees." Then he walked away, leaving Doyle standing there with an answer he had heard clearly, word for word, but couldn't understand. Beatrice, meanwhile, received all those upheavals like someone standing in the middle of a storm without knowing where it had come from. On the day the restaurant closed, she stood with several co-workers before the tightly lowered security gate. Her stomach twisted with worry over the next month's rent and her father's medication. But a few weeks later, an envelope arrived at the third-floor apartment. Inside was a letter from the law firm announcing the settlement, along with a check made out to Beatrice Monroe for nearly $9,000, repayment for all the tips taken from her and all the unpaid overtime she had worked during more than 4 years. Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed, holding the check in both hands and reading every line 3 times. She had worked there all those years, had clenched her teeth each time she saw her share of the tips reduced, and hadn't dared to question it, had stayed to scrub floors until nearly midnight without a word of complaint because she was afraid of losing her shifts. She had never filed a single complaint, had never dared to dream of anything called justice, and yet justice had found its own way to her door at the very moment she needed it most. That evening, she cooked a more generous meal than usual, and while Walter ate with contentment, she looked through the small window toward the distant lights of the city, her heart filled with a question that had no answer. She couldn't understand why the sky had fallen on that exact place, that exact restaurant, that exact owner, or why, among hundreds of people, fate had remembered an unknown waitress like her. She only knew to give silent thanks, just as she had silently thanked the appreciation fund that had paid for her father's birthday cake. She had no idea that those 2 blessings carried the same name, and that name, at that very moment, was sitting behind the darkened window of a black SUV parked 2 blocks from her apartment building, quietly watching the light glowing from her 3rd-floor window before signaling the driver to leave. The check for nearly $9,000 had barely settled into Beatrice's bank account when another envelope arrived, this one bearing the tasteful bronze logo of a name she had only heard in passing, Aurelia, one of the finest restaurants in the downtown district. The letter inside was courteous and professional down to the final period. Dear former employees of Doyle's Chop House, as part of our staff transition program following the closure of your previous workplace, Aurelia is pleased to invite you to interview for currently available serving positions. As soon as Beatrice finished reading, she called 2 former co-workers, and both had received the exact same letter, which reassured her that it was a general program rather than anything unusual. Of everyone in the group, she was the least willing to hope, because Aurelia was the kind of place she had once believed she wouldn't be qualified to enter through its brass-framed glass doors even in her dreams, much less as an employee. But she remained true to herself. She pressed the only white blouse she owned until every wrinkle was gone, arrived 15 minutes early, and answered every question with the kind of honesty that didn't know how to embellish itself. She said she had worked as a server for more than 4 years, that she was accustomed to standing 10 hours a day, and that she could remember the orders of a table of 8 without writing anything down. The manager interviewing her took notes and nodded, and 3 days later, Beatrice received a call telling her she had been hired. On the day she signed the contract, she reached the line showing her salary and had to read it a second time. The amount was nearly 50% higher than what she had earned before. Not a single cent of her tips would be deducted. They would be distributed transparently, according to a publicly posted system, and overtime compensation was clearly stated by the hour. It was the first fair employment package she had ever received in her working life, and that evening, for the first time in many years, Beatrice sat down to calculate the following month's expenses without having to cross a single item off the list. She had no idea that the network of companies behind Aurelia, through layer after layer of paperwork and dry corporate names, ultimately led back to a single signature. And when the man who owned that signature heard Tommy report that the staff transition program had been completed and that her name appeared on the list of successful applicants, he merely nodded once and moved on to the next matter, as though it were only one line among hundreds on his schedule that day. Aurelia had one very special little guest every Friday evening. That was the day Nicholas held late meetings with business partners in a building 2 blocks away. And by a routine that had long since become familiar, Mrs. Costa would bring Lucy to the restaurant first, where they sat at their usual table in a quiet corner and waited for her father to finish his meeting and come collect her. On Beatrice's first Friday at her new job, she was assigned to the very section that included that table. The little girl sat across from the kind-faced older woman, her feet dangling above the floor, ordering politely in the careful manner she had been taught, yet through most of the meal she said almost nothing, simply gazing out the window. Beatrice noticed the child tracing invisible shapes across the tablecloth with her spoon, and her heart, the heart of someone who had once been a little girl growing up without a mother, understood something no one needed to explain. When she brought out dessert, she took a colored pencil from her apron pocket, one she still carried out of an old habit, turned over the paper coaster, and with a few quick strokes, drew a floppy-eared rabbit hugging a carrot larger than its entire body. She placed the drawing beside Lucy's plate, gave her a small wink, and walked away. The child looked at the rabbit, then at the waitress, and for the first time that evening, she laughed aloud. From that day forward, every Friday evening was the same. The moment Lucy entered the restaurant, her eyes searched for Beatrice, and the corner table was no longer silent. The little girl told her stories about school, about the classmate sitting beside her who had broken one of her crayons, about the book she was learning to read on the animals of Africa, and Beatrice, between rounds of carrying plates and taking orders, always found a few minutes to stop and listen to her chatter. Some evenings, Lucy even taught her how to tell a cheetah from a leopard with the solemn expression of a tiny teacher. Mrs. Costa watched all of it from the opposite side of the table without saying a word, but her experienced eyes missed nothing. She had lived in the Falcone mansion long enough to remember how talkative Lucy had once been before losing her mother, and she was perceptive enough to recognize that the laughter everyone thought had been lost was returning each Friday evening at the corner table of a restaurant beside a waitress who kept colored pencils in her apron pocket. One evening, after Lucy had fallen asleep, Mrs. Costa carried a pot of tea into the study and placed it on Nicholas's desk. Before leaving, she paused in the doorway and spoke in the calm voice of a woman who had served the family through 2 generations. "I wouldn't dare disturb you when you're busy, sir, but perhaps you should arrange to arrive at Aurelia earlier than usual one Friday evening, not to collect the child, but to sit and watch her for a while. You'll see something the Falcone fortune hasn't been able to buy in 4 years." Nicholas lifted his eyes from the page. Mrs. Costa gave a slight bow and closed the door, leaving the most powerful man on the south side sitting alone with a steaming pot of tea and a sentence that refused to leave his mind. The following Friday, Nicholas ended his meeting an hour earlier than usual, and instead of waiting in the car outside as he always did, he walked into Aurelia and took the empty chair beside his daughter. Lucy's eyes widened in surprise before she cried out with delight, tugging at her father's hand and showing him the paper coaster with a drawing of a baby elephant spraying water from its trunk, proudly declaring that Miss Beatrice had drawn it and that she was the best artist in the world. Nicholas followed the direction of his daughter's pointing finger, and the woman carrying a tray of drinks across the dining room happened to turn at that exact moment. She recognized him and paused for a heartbeat. She came over to greet the table, and as she drew closer, her eyes opened a little wider. With quiet embarrassment, she said that he was Lucy's father after all, that she had never realized it, that the world truly was small, and that he was the man who had picked up her photograph at the bakery that day. Nicholas nodded and said yes, the world was small, but he said nothing more about that morning. From that week forward, Friday evenings at Aurelia gained a new routine. The man in the black suit began arriving early and sitting at the corner table with his daughter, and between trips across the dining room, the waitress assigned to that section gradually began sharing brief conversations with the unusual guest. At first, they exchanged only polite remarks about the food and about Lucy, but without either of them intending it, those conversations began to grow longer. One evening, while Lucy was absorbed in coloring, Beatrice stood beside the table refilling their water and told Nicholas that her father had once taken her out to dinner on Friday evenings too, though they had gone to a modest diner near the fire station where he worked. Everyone there knew his name, and he always ordered her the largest ice cream on the menu even though her mother had forbidden it. Nicholas asked in his calm voice how long her father had been a firefighter. She answered that he had served for nearly 30 years, that it was the only life he had ever known, and then she smiled, a smile touched by equal parts pride and sorrow. Now he couldn't remember what day of the week it was, she said, but he could still remember the number of the ladder truck he had driven all those years ago. On another evening, she told him about her childhood birthdays, saying that her family had never had much money, but every year her father baked her cake himself. His cakes always leaned to one side, the frosting was spread clumsily, and one year he even burned the entire bottom, yet she had always believed they were the finest cakes in the world. It wasn't until she grew older that she understood the thing that made a cake taste good had never come from the oven. Nicholas listened without interrupting, his fingers resting motionless against his coffee cup. Then, on an evening that ran later than usual, when Lucy had fallen asleep against Mrs. Costa's shoulder and the restaurant was slowly emptying, Beatrice was clearing a nearby table when she quietly said, almost as though speaking to herself, that the cruelest part of her father's illness was that it didn't take everything at once. It stole things little by little. One day he forgot a neighbor's name. The next month he forgot the way home. Then one day would come when he looked at her as though she were only a kind stranger. That was the day she feared most. But she wasn't allowed to cry in front of him, because the doctor had said a patient like him needed peace. Her hands stopped moving, and she suddenly realized she had said too much. She quickly apologized for burdening a customer with her family troubles. Nicholas remained silent for a moment, then spoke in a low, deliberate voice. "My wife died 4 years ago. It happened suddenly. No one had time to say anything to anyone." He paused and slowly turned the coffee cup in his hand before continuing. "Lucy has her mother's laugh. Every time she laughs, it comforts me and reminds me at the same time." He lifted his eyes, and the third sentence left him as softly as a breath. "I still haven't gotten used to such a large house holding only the two of us." Beatrice stood motionless. She didn't know those 3 sentences were more than the man had said about his wife to anyone in the past 4 years. More than Tommy Greco or Mrs. Costa had ever heard. All she saw before her was a widowed father, with sorrow in his eyes, and the manner of a man accustomed to keeping everything behind a closed door, and something inside her softened in a way she couldn't explain. She quietly said she was sorry, then added that Lucy was a wonderful little girl, and that he had raised her well. Nicholas didn't answer. He only gave a slight nod, but Mrs. Costa, who had been watching in silence from across the table, clearly saw the hand resting on his sleeping daughter's shoulder tighten with tenderness. Friday evenings continued like that, carrying them through autumn and into the beginning of winter. And in Beatrice's eyes, the familiar guest gradually came to occupy a place she didn't yet dare to name. He was a courteous, private businessman who loved his daughter and carried loneliness in the way only those who had suffered a great loss could. She knew nothing more than that. But there was one man who knew everything, and he chose an evening in the car, when only the two of them remained behind the darkened windows, to finally speak. Tommy looked at his employer through the rearview mirror and said in the voice of 15 years of loyalty, the kind of loyalty that had earned him the right to speak plainly, "I watch you every Friday, and I'm happy for you. I truly am. But you need to hear me this once. She's clean. Clean from her tax returns to the way she sleeps at night. Your world isn't. It never has been. And it'll never become clean just because you've done a few decent things." Tommy paused, then asked the question he had been carrying for weeks. "So what are you going to do? Are you going to pull her into your world, or are you going to step out of it?" Nicholas didn't answer. He looked through the window as the city lights drifted backward into the distance, and his silence lasted for the entire journey home. Winter came early that year, and with the first wave of bitter wind, a brown envelope appeared in the mailbox of the third-floor apartment. Beatrice knew at once that it wasn't an ordinary bill, because one corner bore a name she had never heard before, Kessler Recovery Group, along with the words "Important Notice Regarding Your Debt," printed in bold, like a warning. She opened it right there at the foot of the stairs, and the farther she read, the colder her fingers became, though not from the wind. The letter informed her that the company had purchased the entirety of Walter Monroe's medical debt from the hospital and related healthcare providers, a total of $47,000, that from the moment of transfer, all payment obligations were now owed to Kessler Recovery Group, and that the debtor had 60 days to pay the balance in full. Beneath that was a dense list of charges labeled account management fee, transfer processing fee, account maintenance fee, harmless-sounding names that, when added together, caused the monthly balance to swell like an interest rate too ashamed to call itself by its true name. And in the final paragraph, written in the velvet-wrapped language of lawyers, the letter stated that if payment wasn't made on time, the company reserved the right to pursue every available method of collection against the debtor's assets, including the property registered in Walter Monroe's name at his current address. When Beatrice reached that line, she had to lean against the wall. The apartment was the only thing her father had managed to keep after a lifetime of work, the only place his decaying memory could still hold on to. He might forget the names of his neighbors, forget dates and days, but he still remembered the armchair beside the window, still remembered the turn into the kitchen, still remembered the crack in the plaster ceiling he had once promised his wife he would repair. The doctor had told Beatrice that for someone with his condition, familiar surroundings were part of memory itself, and tearing him from this home would be like ripping away the final pages of a book already nearly destroyed. She hadn't been able to keep a single dollar of the $9,000 from the settlement. Her father's hospitalization at the beginning of winter, along with a new course of medication, had consumed every cent within weeks, while the original debt had barely moved. She stood at the bottom of the staircase for a long time, folded the letter, drew a breath, then went upstairs wearing a calm expression as though nothing had happened, because the first rule she had made for herself from the day her father fell ill was that she would never let him see his daughter afraid. 3 days later, on a morning when she was off work, Beatrice put on her neatest clothes, gathered proof of income, medical bills, prescription receipts, and the doctor's written confirmation of her father's condition, then took 2 buses to the offices of Kessler Recovery Group inside a cold glass building at the edge of the financial district. She waited for 40 minutes, and when her name was finally called, the person who received her was a collections agent whose smile never reached his eyes. She explained calmly that she wasn't asking them to erase a single dollar, only to give her a payment plan she could afford. She had steady work. She would pay every month without fail. She only needed time. The employee listened to everything, turned through her documents with 2 fingers as though touching something unclean, then replied in a flat voice that the company had no obligation to care about personal circumstances, only cash flow, that its policy for accounts like hers allowed no negotiation, and that 60 days meant 60 days. Beatrice tried once more, her voice beginning to tremble. She said her father had served the city as a firefighter for nearly 30 years, that he was gravely ill, and that the apartment was everything he had left. The man leaned back in his chair, looked her over from head to toe, and said the words she would hear again in her mind for many nights afterward. "Ma'am, this city is full of washed-up heroes who never learned how to manage their finances. If everyone told stories about the past to reduce their debts, this company would have gone bankrupt years ago. You should sell the apartment and pay us now. You'll get a better price than you will after foreclosure. I'm being very kind by telling you that." Beatrice sat still for 2 seconds, feeling each word drive into her. Then she rose, gathered the papers no one had bothered to read, thanked him for his time with every remaining scrap of dignity she possessed, and walked out of that room with her back straight. She kept it straight through both bus rides home, straight during the walk beneath the thin fall of sleet, straight all the way up the stairs to the 3rd floor. But when she reached the apartment door and heard the television inside, heard her father softly humming along with some old song, her legs gave way. She sank into the hallway with her back against the wall beside the door, pressed both hands tightly over her mouth, and cried. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders shaking in waves, hot tears sliding across, fingers numb with cold. She cried for the terror of those 60 days, for the apartment, for the father singing on the other side of the door, without knowing that strangers were already placing a price on the last home he had. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, drew 3 long, slow breaths, rubbed her cheeks until some color returned, and stood to put the key in the lock. The door opened, and Walter turned toward his daughter with a gentle smile. "You're home," he said. "Did anything good happen today?" Beatrice hung her coat on the hook and smiled as brightly as she could. "Yes, Dad. The weather was beautiful today. Let me make dinner. While Beatrice forced herself to count down those 60 days without breathing a word to anyone, on the other side of the city, the name Kessler Recovery Group had also just been placed on Nicholas Falcone's desk through an entirely different path. It began with small signals that ordinary people wouldn't have noticed. Several longtime shop owners on the south side putting their homes up for sale one after another at unusually low prices, a handful of aging apartment buildings changing hands in silence, and whispers drifting through morning coffee shops about some debt collection company knocking on doors from house to house. The Falcone family had been rooted in the South Side for 2 generations, and any movement across that ground, even one as faint as termites gnawing at the base of a wall, would sooner or later reach Tommy Greco's ears. Tommy sent people to investigate, and 2 weeks later, he entered the study carrying a leather briefcase stretched full and wearing an expression that told Nicholas with a single glance that this matter was no small thing. Tommy spread the documents across the desk, and the picture emerged one piece at a time, growing uglier with every fragment added. On paper, Kessler Recovery Group was a medical debt collection company, but the way it operated was no different from a net deliberately dragged across an entire neighborhood. For nearly a year, the company had quietly purchased the medical debts of hundreds of South Side households from hospitals for only a few cents on every dollar, targeting the elderly, the sick, and working families who had no lawyers and didn't know what rights they possessed. Once the debts were acquired, the company piled on fees, created disguised interest charges, shortened deadlines, and issued threats, all to drive debtors into selling their homes for next to nothing or surrendering them to foreclosure. And those properties weren't falling into random hands. Tommy traced the transactions and discovered that most of the seized real estate flowed into an investment fund hidden behind layers of names. And when he followed the chain back to its source, he found only one man, Vance Kessler. Tommy placed the man's photograph on the desk. He was a polished man in his 50s, with the smile of someone who believed everything in the world could be bought if the right price was offered. His records revealed an ambition he hadn't bothered to conceal, a massive redevelopment project being planned for the South Side itself, high-rise buildings, commercial districts, and for that project to take shape, he needed land. A great deal of cheap land, precisely along the streets the Falcone family had regarded as its own territory for decades. In other words, Vance Kessler was using the medical debts of poor people as a shovel, scooping away pieces of ground from beneath the Falcone family's feet, and he wasn't doing it secretly. He was doing it as though he wanted to be seen. Nicholas turned through the pages one by one, his face showing no emotion, until Tommy added a second piece of information, one that made the air in the room grow thick and heavy. "Our people discovered we're being followed," Tommy said. "Not once, but regularly, for several weeks. Unfamiliar cars have been taking turns appearing near the office, near Lucy's school, and even near Aurelia on Friday evenings, taking photographs from a distance and recording schedules. Very professional, very patient. We traced one of them. He was being paid through a private security company, and that company has a contract with Kessler Recovery Group." Nicholas's hand stopped on the page. Someone wasn't merely digging beneath his feet. That person had also dared to send men peering directly into his private life, even into the Friday evenings when he sat down to eat with his daughter. As though to drive home the arrogance of it all, that very afternoon, a call was connected to Nicholas's office line under the pretense of discussing an investment partnership, and the voice on the other end introduced itself with polished courtesy. Vance Kessler speaking. "I think it's time the 2 biggest businessmen on the South Side became acquainted. I hear Mr. Falcone is a man who values the old ways, while I represent the future. The South Side is about to be transformed. I'm only calling to leave you with one thought. Times have changed. A wise man should know what he can still hold on to, and what he ought to let go. I look forward to meeting you." Kessler ended the call first, an insult calculated down to the final second. Nicholas set down the receiver without saying a word, returned to the file, and turned to the longest list, the names of hundreds of debtors whose lives Kessler now held in his hands across the South Side. Each name, each address, each balance arranged in straight columns like a cemetery on paper. Nicholas studied every page with the gaze of a man learning about an enemy through the things that enemy hunted. Then his eyes stopped. Near the bottom of the 4th page, among rows of names printed in perfectly even black ink, one name had been circled in red, the line thick and decisive. The kind of mark made by someone who wanted it understood that this file was different from all the others. Walter Monroe, Nicholas stared at the name, and a strange feeling moved through him. He had never heard it before, yet it seemed as though some invisible thread had tugged softly at his memory. Tommy followed his employer's gaze and explained that according to the file, Walter Monroe was merely a retired firefighter in his 60s, seriously ill, carrying $47,000 in medical debt, living with his daughter in a small apartment, and owning nothing of any real value except the apartment itself. In financial terms, it was among the smallest assets on the entire list. Tommy paused, frowned, and explained further. However, neither Tommy nor his men could understand why a debt collection mogul like Vance Kessler had specifically circled Walter Monroe's name in red ink, elevating a frail old man with a modest debt above all the major commercial properties on the list. The question of that red circle still had no answer when the Falcone Mansion's calendar reached a day that couldn't be postponed: Lucy's birthday. Months had passed since that morning at Marlowe's bakery, and when Mrs. Costa asked the little girl what kind of party she wanted and whom she wished to invite, Lucy didn't ask for a clown or a bounce castle. She only looked up and said one thing: "I want Miss Beatrice, the lady who draws animals. Promise me, Dad." Nicholas studied his daughter for a long moment, then nodded. The invitation was delivered to Aurelia through Mrs. Costa, accompanied by a message saying that the guest of honor would be terribly sad without her, and after a brief moment of uncertainty, Beatrice accepted because she couldn't bring herself to disappoint the wide eyes that waited for her every Friday evening. That Saturday afternoon, a taxi dropped her off before the mansion gates, and from the very first second, Beatrice understood that she was stepping into another world. The towering black iron gates rose beyond anything she had ever imagined could belong to a private home, so high that they no longer seemed designed to protect a family, but to keep the entire outside world away. The guard checked her name against a list, spoke into his radio, and only after receiving some kind of confirmation did the gates slowly open. A gravel drive led through the expansive grounds, and along the way, she counted several men in suits, stationed in places that appeared random at first glance, but, on closer inspection, resembled chess pieces arranged with careful purpose. Each man wore an earpiece, and their eyes didn't look at the guests so much as through them. She reminded herself that wealthy families hired security all the time, but this number of guards didn't feel like something meant merely for peace of mind. It felt like preparation for something. Yet the party in the garden behind the house was unexpectedly warm, with balloons, a 3-tiered cake, and a small band playing children's songs. Lucy, wearing a white dress, came racing across the garden the moment Beatrice appeared, threw her arms around her, then seized her hand and dragged her from one thing to another, eager to show her everything. Beatrice settled onto the grass with the children, pulled out her familiar colored pencils, and before long, a circle of excited little faces had gathered around her, each child waiting for a turn to have a favorite animal drawn. Children's laughter filled the garden, and amid that laughter, Nicholas stood on the terrace watching her without looking away. But from her place on the lawn, Beatrice also began noticing things that didn't quite fit. She saw the adult guests, all men dressed in expensive clothes, lower their heads more deeply than ordinary courtesy required when greeting their host. Some even inclined themselves slightly and waited for Nicholas to offer his hand, never daring to extend theirs first. She saw Nicholas speak quietly to one older guest, and the man's face immediately drained of color before he left the party early. She noticed the way the household staff moved as well, softly and precisely, as though missing a single beat would be a serious offense. Each detail could have been explained on its own, but taken together, they stirred a vague question inside Beatrice, one she quickly pushed away. Today was Lucy's birthday, and she wouldn't allow herself to indulge in troubling thoughts. Darkness fell. The party gradually came to an end, and the children were collected by their families. When Mrs. Costa took Lucy inside to change her clothes, Nicholas approached Beatrice and told her that before the car took her home, there was somewhere he wanted to show her. He led her along a narrow path behind the house, through an arched doorway covered in climbing vines, and a rose garden appeared beneath the warm golden lights. Dozens of rose bushes had been tended with meticulous care, their blossoms so abundant that the fragrance seemed to gather in layers in the night air. "My wife planted this garden," Nicholas said, his voice lowering. "I've kept it exactly as it was when she was alive. She chose every rose bush herself." Beatrice walked slowly between the rows of flowers, reached out to touch a rose petal, and said that anyone capable of growing a garden like this must have known how to love very deeply. Nicholas looked at her beneath the golden lights, at the woman wearing the simplest dress at the entire party. Yet the only person who made Teresa's garden seem alive again, and something inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 4 years, began to thaw without asking his permission. She lifted her eyes, met his gaze, and didn't look away. The space between them narrowed little by little, slowly enough that both of them had more than enough time to stop, yet neither did. Her breath trembled softly. His eyes remained on hers before lowering to her lips. He moved closer, close enough for her to smell the snow lingering on his coat beneath the fragrance of roses. And at that exact moment, the telephone in Nicholas's breast pocket began to vibrate. He intended to ignore it, but it vibrated again in the urgent pattern of 2 short pulses followed by one, a signal only Tommy was permitted to use, and only when the matter couldn't wait. Nicholas stepped back half a pace, apologized to her with his eyes, and raised the telephone to his ear. Tommy's voice on the other end was brief and taut, as a string about to snap. Kessler's people just appeared outside the Monroe building on the south side. 2 men. They stood outside taking photographs, posted some kind of notice on the main entrance, then left. The old man was asleep inside and didn't know anything. Our people were nearby and confirmed there was no confrontation. Nicholas listened, his eyes still fixed on Beatrice as she stood among the rose bushes waiting for him, her face so gentle and peaceful that it hurt, because she had no idea the name Monroe had just been spoken into the telephone. That night, Nicholas Falcone understood that he could no longer stand between 2 worlds, and that he would have to choose between the 2 men living inside him. 3 days after the party, while the memory of the rose garden still made Beatrice smile to herself now and then in the middle of a shift, the envelope appeared. It bore no stamp and no return address, only her name printed in capital letters, and someone had slipped it directly into the mailbox of the 3rd-floor apartment. She opened it at the kitchen table after her father had fallen asleep, and the first things to spill out were photographs. Nicholas stepping out of the black SUV surrounded by bodyguards. Nicholas standing beside men whose names and extensive criminal records were clearly listed in the captions. Then came carefully photocopied investigative articles. Old reports about the underground empire of Chicago's South Side, about the Falcone name mentioned in the guarded language of journalists, about investigations that had gone nowhere, because witnesses had changed their statements one after another. Beatrice's hands began to turn cold. Beneath them was a certified financial statement listing the payments Doyle's Chop House had transferred every month for years into an intermediary account, accompanied by a diagram of arrows showing exactly where the money had gone. Security fees, protection payments, money flowing into the Falcone organization. The restaurant that had stolen every dollar of her tips, that had drained her dry for more than 4 years, had apparently been paying month after month for the freedom to keep doing it, and the man receiving that money bore the same name as the man who had stood beside her beneath the roses 3 nights earlier. But the final document was the blade that cut deepest. It was the corporate ownership chart of Aurelia, the restaurant where she now worked, the place she had believed was the first decent beginning of her life. Layer after layer of shell companies had been peeled away with neat connecting lines, one entity owning another, and at the very end of the diagram, the final name was still the same: Nicholas Falcone. Pinned to the top of the file was a white slip of paper bearing only one sentence. "Who do you think paid for the birthday cake?" Beatrice sat motionless at the kitchen table for a very long time. She didn't cry. Something worse than tears was happening inside her. It was the feeling of someone looking back at every beautiful thing that had happened to her over the past year. The cake paid for by an appreciation fund no one had ever heard of, justice descending unexpectedly upon Doyle's, the invitation from Aurelia, the first decent salary she had ever earned, the Friday evenings, the rose garden, and watching all of it turn, change color, and rearrange itself into a shape she no longer recognized, until she couldn't tell which part had ever been real. The next morning, she called in and asked for the day off. That afternoon, she waited outside Aurelia beneath the heavy first rain of the season, carrying no umbrella, the file wrapped in a plastic bag and held against her chest. When the familiar black SUV pulled up, she stepped directly into its path. Nicholas had barely gotten out when he saw her, saw the bloodless face beneath the rain, and understood before she spoke a word. She pulled out the file but didn't hand it to him. She held it between them like a shield, and her voice was frighteningly calm. The calm of someone who had exhausted every tear the night before. "Someone sent me these," she said. "Photographs of you, newspaper articles about you, documents about Doyle's, and about Aurelia, too. I read them all night. I kept telling myself they might be fake. People can fabricate anything now. She lifted her face and looked directly into his eyes, rain streaming down her cheeks, mingling with something he couldn't distinguish. But I don't need you to answer for the rumors. I don't need you to explain your family name or those accounts. I only need to know one thing. That cake, my father's birthday cake, was it paid for with your money? Rain fell heavily between them. Nicholas stood motionless, the shoulders of his suit darkening as the water soaked through, and he had more than enough ways to escape. A denial, a half-truth, something she would never be able to verify. But he looked into the eyes of the woman who had walked through all those years of hardship, with her back held straight, and he knew she deserved the only thing he could still give her now. Yes, he said. It was my money. Only 3 words. No excuses. No praise for himself. No attempt to hold her there. Beatrice gave a small nod, very slowly, as though she had just placed the final piece into a picture she wished she had never assembled. Then thank you, she said, her voice breaking on the final word. Thank you for the cake, for the job, for everything. But do you know what hurts the most? I've never asked anyone for anything in my life. The only thing I had was knowing that whatever I received was real, and now I don't know whether anything in the past year of my life was ever real at all. She placed the file in his hands and told him she would submit her resignation to the manager that day. Then she turned and walked away through the rain without looking back once, her spine still straight as always, though her shoulders could no longer hold themselves steady. Nicholas remained standing there for a very long time, the file growing wet in his hands as the rain erased every boundary between the street and the sky. He returned home late that evening. Lucy was still awake, waiting for him in the living room. The little girl ran out to greet him, then stopped when she saw his face and asked in a tiny voice, "Dad, are we going to the restaurant to see Miss Beatrice this Friday?" Nicholas knelt until he was level with his daughter, but before he could find the words, Lucy asked again, her wide eyes filled with worry. "Or is Miss Beatrice angry with me? Did I do something wrong, Dad?" And that question from a 6-year-old child cut deeper into Nicholas than any judgment life had ever passed upon him. In the days that followed, the Falcone mansion sank into a kind of silence even its longest-serving staff had never witnessed. Nicholas continued working, continued signing documents, continued listening to reports, but Tommy knew his employer was functioning like a machine so he wouldn't have to stop, because stopping meant thinking about the rain outside Aurelia and the child's question in the living room. And it was during those days that Tommy finally completed the task Nicholas had assigned him before the birthday party. The task both men had temporarily set aside amid everything that had happened, finding the answer to why, among the hundreds of debtors on Kessler's list, Walter Monroe's name alone had been circled in red ink. One morning, Tommy knocked on the study door and entered carrying a thinner file than usual, and there was something different in his manner. This was a man who had brought every kind of terrible news to this desk without a change in expression. Yet today he placed the file down slowly, almost cautiously, then said, "I found the reason for the red mark, but before you read it, there's something I need to tell you. This isn't business anymore." Nicholas opened the file. The first page was a copy of an old Chicago Fire Department report. The paper yellowed even through the reproduction, dated March of 1998. It described a fire at an apartment building on the south side, flames breaking out on the second floor and spreading rapidly upward through the night. All residents had been evacuated, but the report noted one exceptional rescue on the 4th floor, where an 8-year-old boy had been trapped inside an apartment after smoke had completely filled the hallway. A firefighter on duty had gone back upstairs alone in conditions of zero visibility, found the child, and carried him down to safety using the rescue ladder. The boy's name appeared in the victim's appendix, Nicholas Falcone, 8 years old, and the name of the firefighter commended for the rescue was written on the citation line. Walter Monroe, 35 years old. Nicholas sat motionless. The room around him disappeared, and for one moment, the most powerful 36-year-old man on the south side became again the 8-year-old boy, huddled in the corner of that smoke-blinded apartment. On the night that had returned now and then for nearly 30 years in his shallow sleep, without a beginning or an end, leaving only scattered fragments of sensation, the thick, choking smell of burned smoke closing around his throat, the sound of glass cracking somewhere very close. And then those gloves, heavy gloves blackened with ash, sliding beneath his arms and lifting him from the floor, pulling him against the rough surface of a coat that smelled of scorched rubber, while a deep man's voice came through the mask. "Hold on tight, kid. We're going home." For nearly 30 years, Nicholas hadn't known the man's name. His father had searched for him, and the next page of the file revealed that Tommy had carefully included this detail as well, a note based on accounts from older members of the organization stating that the former Falcone boss had once sent someone to the fire station with a large sum of money and a promise that the Falcone family would never forget what had been done. But the young firefighter had refused everything. He wouldn't accept the money, wouldn't accept the debt of gratitude, and wanted nothing to do with the Falcone name. He had said only 5 words before turning away. "That was simply my duty." Nicholas's father had respected that refusal in the manner of the underworld. He never mentioned it again, and over time, the name Walter Monroe fell into obscurity among countless other events in an empire burdened by too much history. Nicholas turned to the final page, and every piece fell into place with a chilling echo. It was a copy of an internal note obtained from Kessler Recovery Group's own system, several brief typed lines attached to Walter Monroe's debtor file. Verification complete. Subject is W.M. From the March 1998 fire report, the individual who rescued NF. Retain this file as leverage. At the proper moment, it'll be worth more than the rest of the list combined. Vance Kessler had dug deeper than Nicholas had ever imagined. He hadn't merely studied his movements through the cars following him. He had excavated Nicholas's childhood, found the man whose face and name Nicholas himself had never known, and turned the old firefighter into a red-marked bargaining piece, waiting for the day it could be placed on the table. Nicholas closed the file, rose, and walked to the window, where he remained for a long time. Outside, snow had begun to fall over the rose garden, now covered for the winter. He thought of that morning at the bakery, of the photograph lying on the tiled floor, of the young firefighter smiling all the way to the corners of his eyes as he carried his little daughter on his shoulders, and he understood why his gaze had lingered on that uniform 1 second too long, why the name Walter Monroe on the page had tugged at some invisible thread inside him. It hadn't been chance that led him into the bakery that morning. It hadn't been chance that made him pay for the birthday cake of an old man he had never met. The man in that photograph had carried him out of the fire when he was 8 years old, had refused every attempt by his family to repay him with 5 simple words. "That was simply my duty," then had quietly continued living his life, growing poorer, growing older, growing sicker, until the day his daughter stood before a bakery counter and counted her money twice, only to find that it still wasn't enough. Nearly 30 years had passed, but the debt hadn't disappeared. It had only traveled patiently along a distant road before returning at last to find the man who owed it. Vance Kessler didn't give Nicholas time to absorb the truth. Exactly 1 week later, an ultimatum arrived, not through the mail, but in the hands of a sharply dressed attorney who requested 15 minutes at Nicholas's office. And the message he carried was wrapped in the courteous language of negotiation. Though stripped bare, it contained only 3 lines. Mr. Kessler proposed that Mr. Falcone surrender all of his interests in the South Harbor district for a symbolic price. In exchange, the debt file belonging to a certain elderly man on the South Side would be quietly closed, and no one would have to leave their home. But if Mr. Falcone refused, the apartment would be seized through proper legal procedure within 1 month, and at the same time, several highly readable documents concerning the Falcone empire, some genuine, some fabricated, though newspapers wouldn't be able to tell the difference immediately, would find their way into the hands of the city's largest newsrooms. The attorney placed his business card on the desk, wished Nicholas a pleasant day, and left. Word spread through the organization as quickly as fire across dry grass, and the men who had spent their entire lives obeying the laws of the underworld had only one response. They waited for orders. Nicholas's most trusted men approached Tommy one after another. Some spoke plainly, saying this had to be handled in the old way, that Kessler needed to be reminded who made the rules on the South Side, that all it would take was one nod from the boss, and everything would be settled within a week without leaving a trace. Tommy carried every one of those proposals into the study, presenting each option honestly, because that was his duty, and then he stood waiting. Nicholas remained seated behind the desk in silence for a very long time. The old way. He knew it better than anyone. It was fast, clean, and effective. His father had used it all his life, and Nicholas had used it for more than a decade. And for that very reason, he also understood the price hidden behind it. Every time it was used, the Falcone name sank deeper into the same darkness that had taken Teresa from him, that had nearly taken him when he was 8 years old if not for an unknown firefighter, and that one day, according to the merciless laws of that world, would come for Lucy. Nicholas didn't sleep that night. Near midnight, he opened the door to his daughter's room and stood silently beside the bed, watching Lucy sleep. One of her arms was still wrapped around the photo album, and the paper coasters covered with colored pencil drawings of animals had been carefully tucked between the photographs of her mother, as though they all belonged to the same collection of precious things. He looked at his daughter for a long time, then returned to the study, opened Walter Monroe's file, placed it beside Kessler's ultimatum, and sat between those two stacks of paper until dawn began to break. On one side was the man who had run into the fire to save him without needing to know who he was. On the other was the road that would turn Nicholas forever into the very thing that man had refused to shake hands with nearly 30 years earlier. The following morning, Nicholas summoned Tommy and the organization's most senior legal team, the people who handled every lawful matter connected to the system, and when he announced his decision, the entire room fell silent. "We don't touch a single hair on Kessler's head," he said. "We're going to fight him with the one thing he isn't expecting, the law, publicly, in broad daylight." He ordered them to review every debt collection file belonging to Kessler Recovery Group that Tommy had obtained, to examine every signature on every debt assignment, every collection letter, and every threat of foreclosure. The results surpassed even their expectations. Numerous debt purchase agreements carried signatures made by unauthorized parties, something the legal profession called exactly what it was: document forgery. Hundreds of collection letters imposed disguised charges that exceeded permitted limits. Most damning of all were the threats to seize homes when no court judgment had ever been issued, exactly like the letter received by the Monroe family. Together, they formed a blatant pattern of violations of the Federal Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, repeated again and again, across hundreds of victims. After reviewing everything, the head attorney looked up and said, "Sir, with this much evidence, the Illinois Attorney General's office won't be able to look away. But I'm obligated to warn you that once this file is submitted and an investigation begins, Kessler will certainly reveal everything he knows about you in exchange for leniency. The light won't shine only on him. It'll shine on our entire system, and on you personally." Everyone in the room turned toward Nicholas. Tommy was the last to speak, his voice dropping lower. "You understand what you're trading away, don't you? I've walked beside you for 15 years to make sure that light never touched you." Nicholas rose and walked to the window overlooking the courtyard where Lucy ran and played every afternoon. When he turned back, his face was calm as deep water. "I understand," he said. "I've accounted for all of it, and I'm signing." He picked up the pen, signed the authorization allowing the entire file to be submitted, then set the pen down and spoke the words Tommy would later remember as the moment his employer changed forever. "It's time my daughter had a father who doesn't have to hide what he does whenever she asks. And if the price is that I have to stand beneath the light, then I'll stand there." The file was submitted to the Illinois Attorney General's office at the beginning of the week, and while the machinery of the law began moving slowly, and with a force nothing could stop, another storm struck the third-floor apartment on the south side without warning. Rain fell heavily that night. Beatrice finished a late shift at the temporary job she had found after leaving Aurelia, and by the time she arrived home, it was nearly 10 o'clock. She opened the door and called softly, "Dad, I'm home." No one answered. The armchair beside the window was empty, and the thin blanket had slipped halfway onto the floor. She called louder and hurried through every room. The bedroom was empty. The bathroom was empty. The kitchen was empty. On the kitchen table, her father's evening medicine remained untouched. Beatrice's heart seemed to drop straight through her body. The front door hadn't been locked. His coat was still hanging on the hook, which meant he had gone out into the freezing rain wearing only the thin clothes he wore around the apartment. She rushed down the stairs and knocked on the neighbors' doors. An elderly woman on the second floor vaguely remembered hearing the elevator about an hour earlier. An hour. Rain was pouring from the sky. Beatrice ran into the street without stopping to take an umbrella, the cold water striking her face as she hurried along the sidewalk calling, "Dad! Dad!" her voice disappearing beneath the roar of rain against metal roofs and pavement. She called the local police and reported that her father, who suffered from dementia, had wandered away, then kept running from one corner to the next, searching beneath every awning and at every bus stop, asking the few people sheltering from the storm whether they had seen an elderly man with white hair. No one had. In the middle of her panic, a thought flashed through her mind. In recent days, her father had often spoken about her mother, murmuring that he needed to pick Ruth up from the bakery, the small shop where her mother had worked part-time when they were newly married. The bakery had closed 20 years ago and stood at the far end of the avenue, 4 blocks from their apartment. Beatrice turned and ran in that direction, water filling her boots, her breath breaking into uneven clouds of white. On the other side of the rain, a black SUV was turning onto that very street. Ever since the notice had been posted outside the Monroe building, Nicholas had ordered his men to keep watch over the area 24 hours a day, and that night, the man stationed nearby had called him. "Sir, Mr. Monroe just left the building alone in the rain. We followed at a distance, as ordered, so we wouldn't frighten him by approaching, but he kept walking. He's standing at the end of the avenue now. We're waiting for instructions." Nicholas was on his way back from the lawyer's office, and he immediately ordered the driver to turn around. The SUV stopped at the beginning of the street. Nicholas opened the door and stepped directly into the rain without an umbrella. At the far end of the empty road, beneath the pale yellow light of a street lamp, a thin figure with silver-white hair stood before an abandoned storefront. Dust covered the glass, wooden boards sealed the entrance, and the old sign had been removed long ago, leaving only a rusted metal frame. Walter stood there with his thin clothes soaked through and clinging to his frail body, both hands pressed against the cold wooden boards, staring into the darkness beyond them as though he could see a brightly lit bakery inside. His lips moved softly. "I came to pick Ruth up." "Why did the bakery close so early?" Nicholas strode toward him. When he reached the old man, he didn't speak at once. He removed his black suit jacket, gave it a slight shake, then draped it over Walter's trembling shoulders, pulling the 2 sides together across his chest to protect him from the wind. Walter startled and turned. He looked up at the tall man standing between him and the rain, his clouded eyes filled with confusion. Then something changed in his face. The haze in his eyes began to clear. The wrinkles around them shifted slightly. He studied Nicholas closely for a long time, as rain struck their shoulders, and then he raised one frail hand and gently touched Nicholas's arm, as though making certain this wasn't a dream. His clouded eyes shifted, wandering between past and present, as he softly murmured to himself about a smoky hallway and a little boy he carried down from the 4th floor so many years ago. Nicholas stepped closer, his voice thick with emotion, and whispered, "It was me, Mr. Monroe. I was that boy." Walter froze, a sudden spark of clear recognition breaking through the haze of his illness. And in a trembling voice he said, "The boy from the 4th floor. That's you, isn't it? You've grown so tall." Nicholas stood motionless. The man who had never bowed his head to anyone in the entire city felt his throat tighten until he couldn't speak. He only nodded slowly, and what ran down his face was no longer only rain. Walter smiled, and the smile brightened his deeply lined face. He patted Nicholas's arm gently and whispered as though speaking to an old comrade, "I knew it. I still remember. That little boy held on so tightly. He never cried once." At that exact moment, the sound of running footsteps and a desperate voice came from the far end of the street. "Dad." Beatrice rushed toward them, her hair soaked against her face, then stopped several steps away. Before her, beneath the street lamp in the pouring rain, her father stood safely wrapped in an oversized black suit jacket, and the man beside him, shielding him from the storm with a wet shirt clinging to his back, was the same man she had walked away from without looking back. She heard her father speak with the delighted voice of a child. "Beatrice, look who it is. It's my boy from the 4th floor. I told you about him. The little boy I carried down the ladder all those years ago. He came back to visit me." Beatrice stood in the rain, looking at her father, then at Nicholas, then at the black jacket wrapped around the old man's narrow shoulders, the boy from the 4th floor, the story her father had told throughout her childhood. The only child he had mentioned again and again among all the rescues of his life. The photograph in her wallet. That morning at the bakery, the way the stranger's eyes had lingered on the firefighter's uniform. Everything collapsed together into a truth that stole the breath from her lungs. 3 people stood silently beneath the rain that night, and a debt nearly 30 years old was repaid. Not with money, but with a coat placed around a pair of trembling shoulders. That winter passed beneath the sound of a debt collection empire collapsing. The investigation by the Illinois Attorney General's office began with an anonymous file arranged with meticulous care down to every period, and once investigators started knocking on the doors of victims across the South Side, the testimonies came pouring in like an avalanche. By early spring, Vance Kessler had been indicted on a long list of charges, including document forgery, fraud, and systematic violations of the Federal Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. The company's assets were frozen, its operating license was revoked, and Kessler Recovery Group collapsed almost as quickly as it had once expanded. The court ruled that the debt purchase agreements bearing forged signatures were invalid, which meant that hundreds of Southside residents, elderly people, the sick, and families who had spent months living in fear of losing their homes, woke one morning to letters informing them that the debts hanging over their heads no longer existed. Among those letters was one sent to the third-floor apartment in the name of Walter Monroe. But just as the legal team had warned, the light didn't shine only on Kessler. In an effort to save himself, he revealed everything he had managed to uncover about the Falcone family, and those documents, some genuine and some fabricated, were enough to make both federal and state authorities turn their attention toward the South Side. What astonished them all was that the man at the head of that name didn't hire an army of attorneys to deny everything and didn't disappear to some distant coast. Instead, he stepped forward willingly. Through his legal team, Nicholas Falcone announced the dissolution of every operation that existed within the gray areas of the law, permanently ended all security payments throughout the district, publicly disclosed the ownership structure of his network of companies, accepted penalties large enough to become newspaper headlines, and cooperated with the investigation under an agreement whose every line had been weighed carefully by prosecutors. The price wasn't small. A substantial portion of his fortune disappeared through fines and back taxes. Several former partners turned against him, and men who had once bowed before him now avoided him as though he carried a disease. For months, the Falcone name appeared across the newspapers in articles Nicholas forbade Mrs. Costa from allowing anywhere near Lucy. Once, Tommy stood watching his employer sign the final documents, surrendering the sources of income that Nicholas and his father had spent 30 years building, and he couldn't stop himself from asking whether Nicholas ever regretted it. Without lifting his head, Nicholas answered, "Of course I regret it, but regret belongs to me, while being clean belongs to my daughter." Amid all that destruction and rebuilding, one thing was quietly created. On the anniversary of the Chicago Fire Department that year, a new foundation was announced, the Walter Monroe Foundation, dedicated to providing medical assistance and living expenses for retired firefighters who had fallen ill and for their families, with an initial donation large enough to sustain its work for decades. The name of the man being honored appeared proudly on every document, accompanied by a quotation from the rescue report dated March of 1998. On the line identifying the founder, there were only a few words: someone who was once saved. The press searched for that person's identity for weeks without success, while Walter's former colleagues came to visit him, took his hand, and told the old man that the entire station was proud of him. Walter only smiled gently, sometimes remembering and sometimes forgetting, but each time he managed to say one complete sentence: "I was only doing my job." One afternoon in early spring, after the snow had completely melted from the paths of the mansion, the gatekeeper called to report that an unexpected visitor was asking to see Nicholas, Miss Beatrice Monroe. Nicholas was seated among stacks of restructuring documents, and when he heard her name, he set down his pen and remained still for a long time before rising. He met her on the front porch and didn't invite her into the elegant drawing room, because he understood that she hadn't come to visit a mansion. Beatrice stood there as simply dressed as ever, her hands folded together, and she went directly to what she had come to say, as was the habit of someone who had never learned to speak in circles. "I've been reading the newspapers for months," she said. "I know what you did and what you lost." She paused and drew a breath. "That night in the rain, I understood why it was my father, why it was the cake, why it was everything. I once told you that I didn't know whether anything from the past year of my life had been real. Now I do. The wrong was real, and the good was real too. They existed inside the same man, and that man made a choice." She lifted her eyes to him, her eyes reddened but her voice steady. "My father keeps asking about the boy from the 4th floor. He wants to see him. I'm cooking lunch this Sunday. It'll only be an ordinary stew, nothing suited to the tastes of your household. But if you and Lucy came, it would make my father very happy." Nicholas looked at the woman standing before him, the woman who had returned his file in the rain and still thanked him for the cake, and who was now offering him something no amount of money or power he had ever possessed could buy: an invitation to lunch. He nodded and said quietly, "We'll be there. Thank you." Beatrice smiled, the first smile she had given him since the rain outside Aurelia, then said goodbye and left. Nicholas stood on the porch watching her disappear beyond the iron gates, and for the first time, those gates no longer seemed like something built to keep the outside world away. They seemed like something opening. Time passed, and on an early summer afternoon, when the sunlight glowed as golden as honey, the rose garden of the Falcone mansion was decorated for a special celebration, Walter Monroe's birthday. There were no distinguished guests, and no orchestra, only a long wooden table set between 2 rows of roses at the height of their bloom, several clusters of balloons whose colors Lucy had chosen herself, and the people who had traveled together through a year filled with storms. Mrs. Costa brought out a pot of stew prepared from the exact recipe Beatrice had personally taught her. Tommy Greco stood grilling meat in a corner of the garden, with the awkwardness of a man more uncomfortable holding a pair of cooking tongs than almost anything else he had ever held in his life. And at the center of it all, Walter sat in the place of honor, looking far healthier than he had a year earlier, thanks to the devoted care he had received. His silver hair neatly combed, and a smile never leaving his face. He still drifted between remembering and forgetting. Sometimes he asked the same question repeatedly, within 10 minutes, and sometimes he called one person by another's name. But there was one strange and beautiful thing he never got wrong. Whenever Lucy ran to his side, he always opened his arms to welcome her, and called her his granddaughter, his precious little granddaughter, as though his heart had made a decision that his memory no longer needed to confirm. Then the most eagerly awaited moment arrived. Beatrice and Lucy carried out the cake they had spent the entire morning making behind a closed kitchen door, refusing absolutely to let anyone see it beforehand. The cake appeared beneath the afternoon sunlight, and everyone around the table burst into affectionate laughter. It leaned heavily to one side. Its white frosting had been spread clumsily, thick in some places and thin in others, and the candles had been planted at crooked angles. It looked exactly like the cake in the old photograph, down to the smallest detail, except that this time it had been made by 4 hands, the 2 hands of a daughter and the 2 tiny hands of a little girl who had managed to smear frosting all the way to her elbows. Walter looked at the cake for a long time, then lifted his eyes to his daughter, his aging eyes filling with tears even as his smile widened. He said that the cake looked exactly like the ones he had made long ago, leaning to one side in precisely the same way, and Beatrice nodded. "Yes, Dad, I copied your cake. It took me forever to make it lean just right." Laughter filled the rose garden. Walter blew out the candles beneath a chorus of applause, and this time he needed only one breath, while Lucy clapped louder than anyone. After the cake had been cut, and the sunlight had turned to a warm shade of orange across the rose petals, Nicholas rose from his chair. He offered no elaborate speech. He simply walked over to Beatrice and removed something wrapped in a thin silk cloth from the breast pocket of his jacket. It was the photograph from all those years ago, the picture that had fallen onto the bakery floor on that fateful morning, now carefully restored until its colors looked fresh again, the young firefighter and the little girl on his shoulders appearing as though they had laughed only yesterday, all of it placed inside a simple silver frame. Beatrice accepted it with trembling hands, and Nicholas quietly told her to turn it over. She turned the frame around. Beneath the old words written by her father, "Every year on my birthday, all I need is to see my little girl smile," there was now another sentence in fresh ink. "Thank you, Dad, for saving me twice. Once from the fire, and once from myself." When Beatrice looked up through eyes blurred with tears, Nicholas was already kneeling on one knee in the middle of the rose garden, holding a ring that was surprisingly simple compared with everything people imagined when they heard the name Falcone. He asked her the question Lucy and Walter had both been waiting to hear for a very long time, while one of them cried out with delight, and the other slapped his knee, laughed heartily, and declared that he had known it all along, because his boy from the 4th floor had always been a capable one. Beatrice laughed through her tears, and her answer dissolved into the joyful cries of a child and the laughter of an old man, surrounded by the fragrance of roses in a garden that had once held only memories and now held a future as well. This story ends there, but what it leaves behind is something we would like to offer to everyone listening. Kindness given freely is never lost. It merely takes a longer road, sometimes a road lasting nearly 30 years, before returning to find the person who first planted it. A firefighter once rescued a child without needing to know his name and refused every dollar offered in gratitude. And when he grew old, weak, and unable to remember most of his own life, that same kindness returned to protect the final years of his life. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies here. Showing respect to another human being, whether that person is a poor waitress or a confused old man, is never a favor granted by the powerful. It is how the powerful prove that they are worthy of the strength they possess, because the most valuable thing we can offer one another isn't money, but dignity. Dear viewers, if today's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video so that we can continue bringing you meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever given or received an unnamed act of kindness like this in real life? Please share the feelings from deep within your heart in the comments. We sincerely look forward to reading every word you write. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.